On a frozen morning in December 1944, Lieutenant John Robert Fox picked up his radio and spoke 6 words that would haunt military historians for decades: "Fire it. Give them hell." What made these words extraordinary wasn't their defiance, it was that Fox was ordering artillery fire directly onto his own position. Within seconds, he would be dead. But why would a 29-year-old officer deliberately choose death? The answer reveals a story so shocking, so impossible to believe, that it took America 53 years to admit it had happened. The question isn't just why Fox died. It's why his sacrifice was buried, forgotten, and denied for over half a century. But to understand that betrayal, we need to go back to the moment when everything changed. Back to a small Italian village where one man's impossible decision saved dozens of lives and challenged everything America believed about heroism, duty, and race. December 26, 1944. Summacolonia, Italy. The morning after Christmas, Fox crouched by the frost-covered window of his observation post, watching shadows move through the village below. His breath fogged the cold glass as he adjusted his field glasses, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The shadows weren't random, they moved with purpose, with coordination. Enemy soldiers in civilian clothes, infiltrating the town house by house. The stone building that served as his observation post was ancient, its thick walls scarred by centuries of weather and warfare. Fox had chosen it carefully 3 days earlier when he volunteered for the extended Christmas assignment. The second-floor position gave him a commanding view of the entire village and the surrounding valley. It was perfect for directing artillery fire. It would also be perfect for dying. He grabbed his radio handset, the metal cold against his palm. "Command. This is Panda 6. I've got movement in the village." Lots of movement. Static crackled back through the speaker. "Copy, Panda 6. What's your assessment?" Fox counted the figures below, his trained eye picking out details that would escape casual observation. The way they moved in small groups. The systematic way they approached each building. The coordination that spoke of careful planning. "Sir, I think we're about to be hit hard." But Fox couldn't have known that in less than 4 hours, he would make a decision so extraordinary that it would redefine what it means to be a soldier. He couldn't have known that his choice would save American lives while costing him his own. And he certainly couldn't have known that his country would spend the next 5 decades pretending it never happened. But what he saw next made him realize that retreat wasn't an option. At exactly 4:15 a.m., the world exploded. German artillery, positioned in the mountains and hidden for weeks, unleashed a coordinated barrage that shook the ancient stone buildings to their foundations. The first shell landed in the village square, sending cobblestones flying like deadly shrapnel. The second hit the church bell tower, toppling the bronze bell that had rung for Sunday services just 2 days earlier. This wasn't random shelling, it was the opening move of a carefully planned assault, timed to coincide with the infiltration Fox had witnessed. Fox dove to the floor as his building trembled. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. His radio skittered across the wooden floor, static mixing with the thunder of explosions. Through the chaos, he could hear the systematic crack of rifles, the harsh shouts of German officers coordinating their assault, the terrified screams of Italian civilians caught in the crossfire. The infiltrators had shed their civilian disguises and joined a full-scale attack. What Fox was witnessing wasn't a raid, it was the opening phase of a major German offensive designed to break through Allied lines and recapture strategic positions in northern Italy. He crawled to his radio, glass crunching under his elbows. "Command, we're under heavy assault. Coordinated attack with artillery support. Enemy strength at least battalion level, possibly more." The response came through bursts of static. All units, fall back to secondary positions. Repeat, all units withdraw immediately. Fox peered through his scope at the carnage below. American soldiers were pinned down behind overturned vehicles and collapsed walls, cut off from their retreat routes, surrounded by advancing German forces. Italian partisans who had fought alongside the Americans for months were being systematically eliminated, caught in the open as they tried to protect their families. Children and elderly civilians huddled in doorways, trapped between advancing Germans and retreating Americans. Fox could see them through his field glasses, terrified faces, helpless people who had already endured years of occupation and warfare. Someone had to cover the withdrawal. Someone had to buy them time. Someone had to coordinate the defensive fire that could turn chaos into organized retreat. Command, this is Panda 6. Remaining in position to direct fire support. Negative, Panda 6. You are ordered to withdraw immediately. Fox looked at the chaos below, then at his radio. In that moment, he made the first of two decisions that would define his legacy. He chose to disobey direct orders from his commanding officer. Sorry, Command. I'm staying. The silence on the radio told him everything he needed to know about how his decision was being received. But Fox had made his choice based on what he could see and his commanders couldn't: the systematic destruction of American defensive positions and the slaughter of innocent civilians. What Fox did next saved dozens of lives, but it also sealed his own fate. From his elevated position, Fox could see the entire battlefield like a deadly chess game. German forces were moving in coordinated waves, following a carefully rehearsed plan. But they were making one critical mistake: they didn't know he was watching. They didn't know that one American officer with a radio and clear fields of fire could turn their advantage into a deadly trap. Fox spread his maps on the floor, correlating what he could see with the grid coordinates that would guide artillery fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, calculating angles, distances, and timing. This was what he had trained for at Fort Benning. This was why the Army had invested months teaching him the deadly mathematics of indirect fire. Fire mission. Grid coordinates 645 to 432. Enemy infantry concentration. Fire for effect. He spoke the coordinates with absolute precision, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. In the artillery world, there was no room for error. One misplaced number could mean the difference between hitting enemy forces and killing friendly troops. The first artillery salvo screamed overhead within seconds, the shells passing so close to Fox's position that he could hear their deadly whistle. The explosion came a heartbeat later, a direct hit on a squad of German soldiers advancing on trapped Americans. The enemy soldiers simply vanished in smoke and flame, their carefully coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. Target destroyed. Adjust fire. Grid coordinates 647 to 435. Enemy machine gun position. Another strike. Another direct hit. Fox was systematically dismantling the German attack, picking off enemy positions with surgical precision. From his vantage point, he could coordinate artillery strikes while avoiding civilian areas and friendly forces. He was turning the Germans' own tactical advantage, their coordinated assault, against them. But the Germans weren't stupid. They quickly realized that someone was directing these impossibly accurate strikes. Someone was watching them, tracking their movements, anticipating their tactics. And they began hunting for the source. Fox watched through his scope as enemy soldiers started moving toward his building. Not randomly, methodically. They had identified the threat and were moving to eliminate it with the same professional efficiency they had shown in their initial assault. He keyed his radio again. Command: enemy forces converging on my position. Request immediate fire support. Give us coordinates, Panda 6. Fox looked at his map, then at the approaching soldiers. The coordinates he needed would place the artillery strike dangerously close to his own position, within the danger radius where even a perfectly aimed shell could cause casualties. But it was the only way to stop the advancing Germans and continue protecting the withdrawal. Grid coordinates 649 to 438. Danger close. I repeat, danger close. There was a pause on the radio. Fox could imagine the artillery crew checking and double-checking his coordinates, making sure they had heard correctly. Panda 6, confirm those coordinates. That's extremely close to your position. Confirmed. Fire the mission. The shells landed 100 yards away. The ground shook so violently that Fox was thrown against the wall. Windows throughout the building exploded inward, covering him with glass. The concussion left his ears ringing and blood trickling from his nose. But through the smoke and dust, he could see German soldiers going down. Their advance temporarily disrupted. The dangerous close artillery strike had bought him time, but it had also revealed his exact position to every German soldier in the area. They now knew where he was, and they were coming for him. But why didn't Fox retreat? Why stay in a position that was becoming a death trap? The answer lay in what Fox could see from his window, something his commanders back at headquarters couldn't. Below, in a bombed-out building that had once been a bakery, 7 American soldiers were pinned down by German forces. They were wounded, outnumbered, with no ammunition for their weapons and no way to reach safety. Fox recognized them through his field glasses. Private Williams from Alabama, barely 19 years old. Sergeant Martinez from Texas, who had 3 children back home. Corporal Johnson from Michigan, who had saved Fox's life during a patrol 2 weeks earlier. These weren't just statistics, they were men he had served with, eaten with, shared stories with during the long Italian winter. German soldiers were positioning themselves around the building, preparing for a final assault. In minutes, those 7 Americans would be overrun and killed. Their families would receive telegrams saying they had died bravely in service to their country. But they would be dead because no one had been able to help them unless someone did something impossible. Fox studied his map with new urgency. The only way to save those men was to call artillery fire directly on the German forces surrounding them. But those forces had now surrounded his building too. Any strike powerful enough to eliminate the threat would have to be centered on coordinates that included his own position. It was an impossible choice. Save himself, or save them. For most people, it wouldn't have been a choice at all. Self-preservation is the most basic human instinct, evolved over millions of years to keep individuals alive. But Fox wasn't operating on instinct anymore. He was operating on training, on duty, on a moral code that placed the mission above personal survival. He was also operating on something deeper, the knowledge that his actions would be judged not just as an individual soldier, but as a black officer in a segregated army. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every display of courage or cowardice would be seen through the lens of race. He carried not just the weight of command, but the burden of representing every African American who wore the uniform. Command: I need another fire mission. What are your coordinates, Panda 6? Fox looked out the window. German soldiers were at the base of his building now, preparing to storm the stairs. He could hear their voices, harsh commands in a language he didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. They were coordinating their assault on his position. The trapped Americans were still pinned down, still waiting to die. In his field glasses, Fox could see Private Williams clutching a photograph, probably his girlfriend or his mother. The young man's face was streaked with blood and dirt, his eyes wide with the fear that comes when you realize you're about to die far from home. Fox thought about his own mother in Cincinnati, who had begged him not to volunteer for the service. He thought about his girlfriend Marie, who was waiting for him to come home so they could get married. He thought about the future he was about to surrender, the children he would never have, the life he would never live. Grid coordinates 649 to 440. Fire for effect. There was a long pause. When the voice came back, it carried a note of disbelief that cut through the static. Panda 6, those coordinates, that's your position. That's correct. But why would any soldier deliberately choose death? What could possibly justify such a decision? To understand Fox's choice, you have to understand what he represented in the context of 1944 America. He wasn't just another officer, he was something the country didn't want to acknowledge, a black man in a position of authority, making life and death decisions for white soldiers in a segregated army that barely tolerated his presence. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, were segregated from the rest of the army not by choice but by policy. They fought the same enemies, faced the same dangers, and showed the same courage as any other unit. But they did it while being told they were inferior, unreliable, and unfit for combat leadership. Fox had graduated from Wilberforce University with honors, earning a degree in mathematics that had prepared him for the complex calculations required of an artillery forward observer. He had excelled in officer training at Fort Benning, where he had been one of only 3 black officers in his class. He had proven himself in months of combat, directing artillery fire with precision that had saved countless American lives, but to many in the Army hierarchy, he was still just a black man who had been given responsibilities he didn't deserve. Every decision he made was scrutinized more carefully than those of white officers. Every order he gave was questioned by soldiers who had been raised to believe that men who looked like him were naturally inferior. Every report he filed was reviewed with skepticism by superiors who expected him to fail. Fox carried not just the weight of command, but the psychological burden of proving that African Americans could be trusted with American lives. He knew that his success or failure would be seen as evidence for or against the capabilities of his entire race. Now, in this frozen Italian village, Fox faced the ultimate test of that trust. 7 American soldiers, white soldiers from the segregated structure of the army, were about to die unless he acted. And the only action that would save them would cost him his life. For Fox, the choice was actually simple. This was what he had trained for. This was why he had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. This was his chance to prove, once and for all, that courage knows no color and that duty transcends race. Panda 6, please confirm. You're requesting artillery fire on your own position. Fox could hear German voices in the stairwell below, the heavy sound of boots on stone steps. In seconds, they would reach his floor. He could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating their final assault on his position. Through his window, he could see the trapped Americans making their last preparations. They had run out of ammunition. They were using their empty rifles as clubs, preparing to fight with their bare hands. They were going to die bravely, but they were going to die unless he stopped it. Affirmative. Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell. What happened next shocked even seasoned military commanders. On the other end of the radio, Lieutenant Otis Zachary stared at his fire control panel in disbelief. Fox was his friend. They had trained together at Fort Benning, shared stories about their families during long nights on guard duty, talked about what they would do after the war ended. Zachary was also black, also part of the segregated structure that kept African American soldiers separated from their white counterparts. He understood the pressures Fox faced, the constant need to prove himself worthy of command. But this was beyond anything either of them had ever contemplated. "John, you don't have to do this. Fire the mission, Otis. That's an order." Zachary's hand hovered over the fire control switch. Everything in his training told him to refuse. You don't fire on your own men. You don't deliberately kill your friends. You don't trade one life for others, no matter what the mathematics of war might suggest. But Fox's voice carried the absolute authority of a man who had already made peace with death. More than that, it carried the weight of military discipline and the chain of command that both men had sworn to uphold. Those boys are going to die if you don't fire. You know what needs to be done. Don't make their deaths meaningless. Zachary closed his eyes and activated the fire mission. His hands moved automatically through the familiar sequence, checking coordinates, calculating trajectory, setting fuses. The mathematics of death, performed with mechanical precision. The artillery barrage lasted exactly 47 seconds. 6 shells, each one a direct hit. The stone house where Fox had made his last stand simply disintegrated under the impact, its ancient walls collapsing in a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. When the smoke cleared, the German assault had been shattered. The coordinated attack that had seemed unstoppable just hours earlier was now a chaotic retreat. The systematic advance that had threatened to overrun American positions had dissolved into individual soldiers fleeing for their lives. The 7 trapped American soldiers were free. They had lived through the artillery barrage that killed their would-be executioners. Dozens of Italian civilians had escaped to safety while German forces were distracted by the devastating bombardment. The cost: one deliberately chosen life that saved dozens of others. But that was just the beginning of the story. Because what happened next revealed something ugly about America that the country desperately wanted to hide. When American forces retook Samacolonia 3 days later, they found Fox's body in the rubble of his observation post. He was lying next to his radio, his hand still reaching for the handset. His body was intact despite the devastation around him, killed not by shrapnel but by the concussion of the artillery strike he had called on himself. Around him were the bodies of German soldiers, some so close they could have touched him. The enemy forces had reached his position just as the artillery fire arrived, creating a scene of destruction that testified to Fox's perfect timing and ultimate sacrifice. The scene was immediately photographed and documented by military intelligence officers. The images showed the devastating effectiveness of Fox's final artillery strike, the precision with which he had coordinated his own death to achieve maximum tactical effect. Fox's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ross, arrived with the first wave of troops to retake the village. Ross was a career soldier who had seen combat in North Africa and Italy, a man who understood the difference between ordinary courage and extraordinary heroism. As he stood in the ruins of Fox's observation post, Ross began composing what he knew would be a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration America could bestow on its heroes. Ross had seen brave soldiers before. He had recommended men for Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Distinguished Service Crosses. He had witnessed acts of courage that had saved lives and turned the tide of battles. But he had never seen anything like what Fox had done. This wasn't just courage, it was something beyond courage. It was the deliberate sacrifice of one life to save many others, calculated with mathematical precision and executed with absolute commitment. It was the kind of heroism that defined the highest ideals of military service. The paperwork was comprehensive and detailed. Ross interviewed the 7 soldiers Fox had saved, documenting their testimony about the circumstances of their rescue. He gathered statements from Italian civilians who had witnessed the battle. He included tactical assessments of how Fox's sacrifice had prevented a larger German breakthrough. The recommendation was filed, endorsed by every level of command up to division headquarters, and sent up the chain of command to Washington. Fox's actions were so clearly extraordinary that Ross expected quick approval. The Medal of Honor seemed like a foregone conclusion, then the paperwork disappeared. Not lost in bureaucratic confusion. Not misplaced by overworked clerks. Not delayed by the chaos of wartime administration. Deliberately buried by a military establishment that wasn't ready to honor a black hero with the nation's highest military decoration. But why would the Army deny recognition to a soldier who had clearly earned it? The answer lay in the uncomfortable realities of America in 1944, a country still struggling with the fundamental contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while denying equality at home. This was a nation where black soldiers fought in segregated units, where black officers commanded only black troops, where the military reflected and reinforced the racial prejudices of the broader society. The Army's official position was that integration would undermine military effectiveness and unit cohesion. The idea of a black officer sacrificing his life to save white soldiers was politically explosive. It challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and military capability that underpinned the entire system of segregation. If Fox was heroic enough to earn the Medal of Honor, how could the Army justify its policies of segregation and discrimination? If a black officer could display such extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance, what did that say about the military's assumptions regarding African American capabilities? The Medal of Honor wasn't just a military decoration, it was a symbol of American values and heroism. Recipients became national heroes, their stories told in newspapers and magazines across the country. They were invited to speak at war bond rallies and recruitment events. They became the face of American courage. The military leadership couldn't envision a black face representing American heroism to a nation that still believed in racial inferiority. So the inconvenient truth was buried. Fox's radio transmissions were classified as sensitive military communications. Witness statements were sealed in intelligence files. The photographs of his heroic sacrifice were locked away in classified archives. Even the German records that documented the effectiveness of his final artillery strike were restricted from public access. Instead of the Medal of Honor, Fox was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star, a respectable decoration that recognized his service without elevating him to the pantheon of American heroes. His family was told he had died bravely in combat while directing artillery fire. They were not told he had single-handedly saved dozens of lives through an act of deliberate self-sacrifice. The cover-up was systematic and thorough. For 38 years, John Robert Fox was just another name on a casualty list, his extraordinary heroism hidden from history by a military establishment that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's been buried by injustice. In 1982, nearly 4 decades after Fox's death, military historian Charles Thomas was conducting research on African American contributions to World War II when he stumbled across Fox's original Medal of Honor recommendation in a classified archive at the National Records Center. Thomas was researching a broader study of segregated units in the European theater, trying to document the combat effectiveness of African American soldiers who had been systematically excluded from official histories of the war. He was looking for evidence that would challenge the prevailing narrative that black soldiers had been ineffective in combat. What he found exceeded his wildest expectations. The Fox file contained not just the original Medal of Honor recommendation, but the complete tactical assessment of his actions. The documents described an act of heroism so extraordinary that Thomas initially assumed they were fictional, perhaps part of a training scenario or propaganda exercise, but the documentation was too detailed, too specific, too carefully corroborated to be anything but authentic. Witness statements, tactical reports, casualty assessments, even captured German intelligence reports all confirmed the same impossible story. an American officer had deliberately called artillery fire on his own position to save his men and achieve tactical objectives. Thomas couldn't believe that such an extraordinary act of heroism had been completely omitted from the historical record. The actions described were so clearly worthy of the highest military honors that their absence from official recognition could only be explained by deliberate suppression. He brought his findings to the attention of military historians, civil rights organizations, and eventually the media. Slowly, painfully, the story of Fox's sacrifice began to emerge from decades of official silence. The initial response from the military was predictable: bureaucratic denial and administrative delay. Officials claimed that Fox's case had been properly reviewed, according to the standards of his time. They pointed out that he had received appropriate recognition, the Bronze Star, for his actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The original recommendation, endorsed by multiple levels of command, clearly stated that Fox's actions met the criteria for the Medal of Honor. The tactical assessment demonstrated that his sacrifice had prevented a major German breakthrough. The witness statements confirmed that he had deliberately chosen death to save other soldiers. The breakthrough came in 1993, when the Army was forced to confront a systematic pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond Fox's individual case. A comprehensive study commissioned by Congress revealed that African American soldiers had been routinely denied consideration for medals of honor during World War II, regardless of their actions. The study was conducted by Shaw University, a historically black institution in North Carolina that had been commissioned to review military records and determine whether racial discrimination had affected the awarding of military honors during World War II. The evidence they uncovered was overwhelming and undeniable. Of the 464 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not a single one had gone to an African American soldier. This statistical impossibility couldn't be explained by coincidence or circumstance. It was institutional racism codified in military policy. The researchers identified dozens of cases where African American soldiers had performed actions that clearly warranted the Medal of Honor but had been denied consideration because of their race. Fox's case was not an aberration. It was part of a systematic pattern of discrimination that had operated throughout the war. The study recommended that 10 African American veterans, including John Fox, be awarded the Medal of Honor for actions that clearly met the criteria for the nation's highest military decoration. The recommendation triggered 4 years of fierce debate within the military establishment and the broader American political system. Some argued that the standards of 1944 shouldn't be judged by the standards of the 1990s, that historical injustices couldn't be corrected retroactively. Others maintained that heroism was colorblind and that Fox's actions spoke for themselves, regardless of when they were finally recognized. They pointed out that the Medal of Honor had no statute of limitations, that courage didn't diminish with time. During this time, Fox's story began to gain national attention. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of the forgotten hero who had saved lives through ultimate sacrifice. Television documentaries explored the systematic exclusion of African American heroes from military honors. Public pressure mounted steadily. Veterans organizations that had once been silent began demanding justice for soldiers who had been denied recognition because of their race. Civil rights leaders pointed to Fox's case as evidence of how deeply racism had infected American institutions, even in moments of supreme sacrifice. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by families, veterans, and military leaders. The ceremony had been planned for months, coordinated with military protocol officers and civil rights organizations. In the president's hand was a blue ribbon holding a 5-pointed star, the Medal of Honor. Today we honor 7 African American soldiers whose valor in World War II has gone unrecognized for far too long, Clinton said, his voice carrying the weight of historical significance. Their stories remind us that heroism knows no color, and that justice, though delayed, must never be denied. The ceremony was both a celebration and an acknowledgement of failure. It recognized extraordinary courage while admitting to decades of institutional racism. It honored the dead while exposing the ugliness of systematic discrimination. One by one, the families of the 7 soldiers stepped forward. Some recipients were still alive, ancient men in their 70s and 80s who had waited over half a century for recognition. Others, like Fox, were represented by family members who had never given up the fight for justice. When Fox's name was called, his sister Sandra stepped forward to accept the medal on his behalf. She was 89 years old, one of the few family members still alive who remembered John as more than just a name on a casualty list. Her steps were slow but determined, her back straight with pride and pain. Lieutenant John Robert Fox, Clinton read from the citation, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. As the medal was placed in Sandra's hands, she whispered words that few in the audience could hear but everyone could understand. Finally. Finally, they remember. The ceremony lasted 1 hour. The injustice it sought to correct had lasted 53 years, but why did it take so long? What kept Fox's heroism buried for over half a century? The answer lies in the uncomfortable intersection of heroism and politics, courage and racism, individual sacrifice and institutional self-interest. Fox's story wasn't just about military valor, it was about the lengths to which organizations will go to protect their own prejudices and assumptions. When classified documents were finally released under the Freedom of Information Act in the 2000s, researchers discovered the full scope of the military's systematic cover-up. Internal memos revealed explicit policies designed to minimize African American contributions to the war effort while maintaining the facade of equal treatment. One memo, dated February 1945 and stamped "Confidential," stated that recommendations for high-level decorations for Negro personnel should be carefully reviewed to ensure appropriate recognition without creating unrealistic expectations for similar awards. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear: black soldiers could be honored, but not too much. They could receive recognition that maintained morale within segregated units, but not recognition that might challenge the broader system of racial hierarchy. Another memo, from the Office of the Secretary of War, discussed the political implications of awarding medals of honor to African American soldiers. The concern was explicit: such recognition might fuel demands for racial equality at home, undermining the military's policy of segregation and the broader social order it reflected. The logic was cynical but internally consistent. If black soldiers were heroic enough to earn the nation's highest honors, how could the nation justify denying them basic civil rights? If they could be trusted with life and death decisions in combat, how could they be considered unfit for integration in peace? Rather than confront these contradictions, the military chose to suppress the evidence. Heroism was classified. Sacrifices were minimized. Stories that challenged racial assumptions were buried in classified files. Fox's case was just one of hundreds. The 1993 Army study identified numerous African American soldiers whose actions clearly warranted medals of honor but who had been systematically excluded from consideration. Of those cases, only 10 resulted in eventual recognition. The rest remain in bureaucratic limbo, their heroism acknowledged in classified files but never honored in public ceremony. In 2005, historian David Williams made a discovery that revealed the full extent of the bureaucratic conspiracy that had buried Fox's heroism. While researching military records for a book about World War II heroes, Williams found something that shouldn't have existed: Fox's original Medal of Honor recommendation, complete with routing slips and endorsements. The document was supposed to have been destroyed or lost decades earlier. Instead, It had been misfiled in an archive at the National Record Center, preserved by bureaucratic error in a folder marked Administrative Correspondence, Miscellaneous. The paper trail told the complete story of how Fox's heroism had been deliberately suppressed. The recommendation had been written by Lieutenant Colonel Ross immediately after the battle, filed through proper channels, and endorsed at every level of command up to division headquarters. The recommendation had reached the office of General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army in Italy. Clark, who would later become famous for his role in the Italian campaign, had personally reviewed the case and endorsed it with a handwritten notation, "Extraordinary valor. Immediate action recommended." From Clark's office, the recommendation went to Army headquarters in Washington, where it was reviewed by a board of senior officers. The board's unanimous conclusion, documented in their official minutes, was that Fox's actions clearly met the criteria for the Medal of Honor, but the recommendation never reached the Secretary of War for final approval. Instead, it was diverted to a special review board that had been quietly established to assess recommendations for African American soldiers. This board, which operated without public knowledge or official authorization, had been created with a single purpose: to ensure that black soldiers didn't receive recognition that might challenge prevailing racial attitudes or military policies. The board's assessment of Fox's case was brief and damning. While Lieutenant Fox's actions were commendable and worthy of recognition, they do not rise to the level requiring the nation's highest military honor. Recommend award of Distinguished Service Cross or lesser decoration. The original Medal of Honor recommendation was then filed away in a classified folder, where it sat for 53 years, testimony to an injustice that the Army hoped would never come to light. Williams's discovery triggered a new investigation that revealed the existence of similar review processes affecting dozens of other African American soldiers. The special board had systematically downgraded or denied Medal of Honor recommendations for black servicemen throughout the war, creating a parallel system of recognition that maintained the appearance of fairness while ensuring continued discrimination. But perhaps the most shocking revelations came from an unexpected source: German military records that were declassified in the 1990s as part of a broader effort to document World War II history from all perspectives. Wehrmacht after action. Reports, translated for the first time since the war, revealed that Fox's final artillery strike had done far more than just eliminate the soldiers surrounding his position. The bombardment had shattered the morale of the entire German unit and fundamentally altered their assessment of American fighting capabilities. The German commander, Oberst Hans Müller, wrote in his official report, "The American defense at Samakalnia displayed a level of fanatical determination that exceeded our expectations. The enemy's willingness to sacrifice individual soldiers for tactical advantage suggests a commitment to victory that may prove impossible to overcome through conventional means." Müller's assessment was based specifically on Fox's actions. German survivors of the artillery strike had reported the shocking sight of an American officer deliberately calling fire on his own position. The psychological impact of this action, the demonstration that American soldiers were willing to die rather than retreat, had convinced German forces that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The German unit, which had been scheduled to continue offensive operations toward the strategic port of Livorno, was pulled back for tactical reassessment and reinforcement. The offensive was never resumed, partly because German high command had concluded that American morale and fighting effectiveness were too high to overcome with available resources. Fox's sacrifice hadn't just saved the soldiers in Samakalnia, it had helped prevent a larger German breakthrough that could have prolonged the war in Italy and cost thousands of additional lives. But the German records revealed something even more poignant and personal. Among the casualties found around Fox's position was Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a 22-year-old officer from a small village in Bavaria. Weber had been leading the assault on Fox's building when the artillery strike arrived, dying just meters from the American position. Weber's personal effects, carefully catalogued by German graves registration units, included an unfinished letter to his mother. The letter, written on Christmas Day, described his homesickness, his hope to return home soon, and his plans to study engineering after the war. Liebe Mutti, the letter began in careful script. Today is Christmas, but it doesn't feel like Christmas here in these mountains. I think of home, of your cooking, of the church bells on Christmas morning. This war will end soon, I hope, and I will come home to help rebuild what has been destroyed. The letter was never finished. Weber had died carrying it in his breast pocket, just meters from Fox, two young men from different countries, different backgrounds, different sides of a war that had brought them together in a moment of mutual destruction. Both men, Fox and Weber, had died on December 26, 1944. Both had been fighting for their countries, following orders, doing their duty as they understood it. Both had families waiting for them, futures they would never see, dreams they would never fulfill. Weber's letter was returned to his mother in Bavaria, along with the official notification of his death. Fox's heroism was buried in classified files, hidden from his family and his country for over half a century. In 2019, on the 75th anniversary of Fox's death, the village of Samokolonia announced a discovery that surprised even the most dedicated students of his story. Local historians, working with the village priest to renovate the ancient church, had discovered a cache of documents hidden in a sealed chamber beneath the altar, documents that had been concealed there since the end of the war. The discovery was accidental. Workers renovating the church floor had noticed an irregularity in the stone foundation. When they investigated, they found a small chamber that had been carefully sealed with mortar and hidden for decades. Inside were dozens of documents, preserved in a waterproof container, letters, photographs, official papers, and personal testimonies that had been hidden by villagers who feared they might be destroyed or confiscated during the chaotic final months of the war. Among the papers were first-hand accounts by Italian villagers who had witnessed Fox's final battle. The accounts, written in 1945 but never shared with American authorities, provided new details about Fox's actions and their impact on both the battle and the local population. One account, written by the village priest Father Giuseppe Martelli, described watching Fox in his observation post during the final moments before the artillery strike. According to Martelli, Fox had spotted a group of German soldiers preparing to execute captured Italian partisans in the village square. L'ufficial americano poteva vedere quello che stava per accadere, Martelli wrote in careful Italian script. Poteva scappare. Poteva salvar se stesso. Invis, ha preso la sua radio e ha scelto di morire per salvar altri. Non ho mai visto un tale coraggio. The account revealed that Fox's decision wasn't just about saving American soldiers, it was about protecting Italian civilians and partisans who had fought alongside Allied forces. His sacrifice had prevented not just military casualties but the execution of prisoners and the murder of non-combatants. Another account, by a villager named Maria Rossi who had been hiding in a cellar with her children, described the immediate aftermath of the artillery strike. Rossi had emerged from her hiding place to find German soldiers retreating in complete disarray, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape. Avevano paura, she wrote. Il sacrificio dell'americano li aveva spaventati più di qualsiasi esercito. Avevano visto un uomo seguire la morte piuttosto che la ritirata, e questo aveva spezzato il loro spirito. But the most remarkable discovery was a letter written by a German soldier named Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had been wounded in Fox's final artillery strike but had survived. Hoffmann's letter, written from a German field hospital to his wife in Hamburg, provided a unique perspective on Fox's actions from the enemy point of view. Ich wurde, als der Amerikaner das Führer auf sich selbst fordert, Hoffmann wrote in careful Gothic script. Ich habe in Polen, Frankreich und Russland gekämpft. Ich habe mutige Männer und fähige Männer gesehen, Helden und Schurken. Aber ich habe nie etwas gesehen wie das, was dieser amerikanische Offizier getan hat. Sah uns durch sein Fenstern, wissend, dass uns nur durch seinen eigenen Tod vernichten konnte, und entschied sich dafür. Ich kann keinen Mann mit solchem Mut hassen, auch wenn mein Feind ist. The letter revealed that even enemy soldiers had recognized the extraordinary nature of Fox's sacrifice. Hoffmann's testimony confirmed that Fox's actions had been deliberate, calculated, and executed with full knowledge of the consequences, not the panicked decision of a desperate man, but the considered choice of a professional soldier who had weighed all options and chosen duty over survival. So why did Lieutenant Fox order his own death? The answer isn't simple, because Fox's decision represented multiple choices made simultaneously, each one reflecting different aspects of his character, training, and moral code. He chose duty over survival. As a forward observer, his job was to direct artillery fire in support of American operations. When his position became untenable, most soldiers would have withdrawn to safety. Fox chose to remain at his post and continue his mission, even when it meant certain death. He chose others over himself. The mathematical calculation was stark: his life for the lives of 7 trapped soldiers and dozens of civilians. From a purely utilitarian perspective, the choice was obvious. But choosing to act on that calculation required a level of moral courage that few people possess. He chose to prove that courage knows no color. Fox understood that his actions would be judged not just as an individual soldier, but as a representative of African American military capability. Every black officer in a segregated army carried the burden of proving that men of their race could be trusted with American lives. Fox's sacrifice was the ultimate proof. He chose to be the soldier he had always intended to be. From his graduation from Wilberforce University through his training at Fort Benning to his service in Italy, Fox had consistently chosen the harder path, the more dangerous assignment, the greater responsibility. His final decision was consistent with a lifetime of choices that prioritized service over safety, but perhaps most importantly, Fox chose to act on the principle that all lives have equal value. In a segregated army that treated black soldiers as inferior, Fox demonstrated through his sacrifice that he valued white lives as much as his own, not because of their race, but because of their shared humanity. His decision saved 7 men that day. It protected dozens of civilians. It prevented a larger German offensive that could have prolonged the war. And ultimately, it forced America to confront the uncomfortable truth about its own prejudices and the heroes it had chosen to forget. The final chapter of Fox's story continues to be written today. In 2020, the U.S. Army announced the establishment of the John R. Fox Award for Exceptional Valor, to be given annually to soldiers who demonstrate extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The award carries no monetary value, but recipients have their names permanently inscribed at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia. The first recipient was Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had single-handedly held off a Taliban assault in Afghanistan for 6 hours, allowing her unit to evacuate wounded soldiers. In accepting the award, Gonzalez said she drew inspiration from Fox's example. "Lieutenant Fox showed us that true heroism isn't about surviving," she said during the ceremony. "It's about choosing to do what's right, even when the cost is everything you have to give." He proved that courage doesn't come from the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth, it comes from the choices you make when everything is on the line. The Army also announced plans to name a new training facility at Fort Johnson after Fox. The Lieutenant John R. Fox Leadership Academy will train forward observers and artillery specialists, ensuring that future generations of soldiers learn about tactical coordination and personal courage from Fox's example. The Academy's mission statement, carved in granite at the entrance, reads, "In memory of Lieutenant John R. Fox, who demonstrated that the highest form of leadership is the willingness to sacrifice everything for others." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. In 2021, the German Bundeswehr, the modern German army, announced that it would include Fox's story in its training curriculum as an example of military professionalism and ethical decision-making under extreme circumstances. Colonel Hans Weber, a descendant of the German lieutenant who died in Fox's final artillery strike, attended the announcement ceremony at the Bundeswehr Command and Staff College. He spoke about the complex legacy of war and the importance of honoring courage, regardless of which uniform it wore or which flag it served. "My great-uncle Klaus died that day in Samokolonia," Weber said, his voice carrying the weight of family history and national reconciliation. Lieutenant Fox also died that day. They were enemies, but they were both soldiers doing their duty as they understood it. Today, we can honor both their sacrifices while working to ensure that future generations never face such choices. Weber's words reflected a broader European effort to commemorate World War II not just as a national triumph or tragedy, but as a human catastrophe that had required extraordinary sacrifices from ordinary people on all sides. The ultimate lesson of John R. Fox's story transcends military history and national boundaries. Fox's deliberate choice to call artillery fire on his own position represents something profound about human nature and moral courage. He faced a decision that tested every instinct for self-preservation, every rational calculation of personal cost and benefit, every normal human desire to survive and return home to the people who loved him. In that moment of ultimate choice, Fox demonstrated that heroism isn't about superhuman strength or impossible odds. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when everything depends on doing what's right. His story also illustrates the persistent power of institutional racism and the long struggle for justice in American society. Fox's 53-year wait for recognition wasn't an administrative oversight or bureaucratic incompetence. It was the product of systematic discrimination that denied African American soldiers the honors they had earned through blood and sacrifice. The delay in recognizing Fox's heroism reflects broader patterns of exclusion and marginalization that have shaped American history from its founding to the present day. His eventual recognition represents progress, but it also serves as a reminder of how much injustice was tolerated for how long, and how many other heroes remain forgotten in classified files and unmarked graves. Today, Fox's story is taught in military academies around the world, studied in history classes from elementary school through graduate programs, and remembered in memorials from Italy to Ohio. But the most important audience for his story may be future generations who will face their own moments of moral choice, their own tests of character and courage. When they do, they can remember Lieutenant John R. Fox, who looked through a window at approaching enemies, picked up a radio, and chose to save others at the cost of his own life. They can remember that heroism doesn't require recognition or reward. It only requires the choice to do what's right when it matters most. Fox died on December 26, 1944, in a small Italian village whose name most Americans had never heard. But his story didn't end that day. It continued through 53 years of denial and 27 years of recognition. It lives on in the training of soldiers, the inspiration of families, and the collective memory of a nation still learning what it means to honor all its heroes. On a snowy morning in the mountains of Italy, one man chose to die so others could live. America took 53 years to say thank you, but thank you is better than never. And Fox's legacy, the proof that courage knows no color and that duty transcends all other considerations, will endure long after the last witness to his sacrifice has joined him in whatever peace awaits the truly brave.